Super Games Buster, where we take a critical look at video games and talk about them like there's no tomorrow. This time we'll be covering a rather interesting gem of a game, if only because the history behind its development is kind of fascinating. Now, it's no secret that there were a lot of mascot characters in the 90s, and that a lot of these mascot characters flew under the radar. However, even if some of these mascot characters never reached critical acclaim, there are still some mascot characters that have garnered cult followings, such as Bubsy, Croc, Gex, and Tomba, just to name a few. We're not going to be talking about any of those, though. Oh no! We're going to be talking about a mascot character whose theme song is legendary among the gaming community. I'm using that term loosely. You're going to hear this theme song, and let me tell you, you will not be able to forget it. And what's this theme song, you ask?
What about now? It's time to rock with the biggity buck Bumble. What about now? It's time to.
You have my permission to hate me now.
Buck Bumble was released for the Nintendo 64 on September 30th, 1998 in North America, and December 18th of the same year in all the other regions. It was published by Ubisoft, but was actually developed by Argonaut Games, who are famous for creating the Super Effects chip that made the original Star Fox possible. Now, Argonaut Games has a very interesting history with Nintendo. In addition to creating the Super Effects chip, they were also responsible for the NES glider prototype that eventually turned into Star Fox. However, their history together can be traced all the way back to the original Game Boy, when Argonaut Games was working on a demo for a little game called X. X was a Japan-only game released in 1992, and it was the first handheld game to have a 3D perspective. It caught Nintendo's attention, and eventually led to them conceptualizing the NES glider prototype with the help of Argonaut Games. However, even after porting the prototype to the Super Nintendo, and hitting the upper limits of what the Super Nintendo was capable of, it was impossible to create the kind of game they wanted. Thankfully, Nintendo allowed Argonaut to create custom hardware to make the Super Nintendo capable of handling 3D graphics. And from this, both Star Fox and the Super Effects chip were born. Nintendo and Argonaut's relationship didn't last very long, though. Between Nintendo not paying Argonaut royalties for technologies used in Star Fox 64, and Argonaut's failed pitch to make a 3D platformer with a Nintendo property, their relationship ended somewhat suddenly. As such, this makes Buck Bumble a bit of an oddity, because not only is it the last Nintendo-exclusive Argonaut developed, but it was released after Star Fox 64, at a time when Argonaut presumably wanted nothing to do with Nintendo.
There's a lot of speculation to be made about this game, and it's honestly kind of fascinating to me. I mean, was it developed because Argonaut resented Nintendo for profiting from Star Fox? Or was it developed before things turned sour and released nonetheless? It's honestly hard to tell, even with all the evidence present. However, the question we're here for is Buck Bumble any good? Let's find out.
The story for Buck Bumble is relatively simple. In the far-off distant year of 2010,
Oh my god, are you serious?
a chemical spill takes place in rural England and mutates all the insects in the area. Most of these mutated insects gather together to form the Evil Herd, an army led by the Evil Herd Queen. However, there are other insects who wish to oppose the Evil Herd, and these insects have gathered together to form the Resistance. You play as Buck Bumble, a bumblebee with cyborg implants that works for the Resistance. It's your job to fight the Evil Herd and save the garden in the process. As Buck Bumble, you can fly, shoot, and... well, actually that's about it. Really, the game's all about flying and shooting.
If you want to get technical, this is an action game. The main emphasis is on Buck's ability to both shoot down enemies and traverse the levels via flight. To that extent, there are 11 different weapons to try out and 19 stages to try them out on. Suffice it to say, the developers definitely tried to pack this game with content.
The objective in each stage usually involves either reaching the end of the level, destroying a certain number of enemies, or carrying bombs to strategic enemy locations. There's even a level that involves kidnapping baby bugs and bringing them back to base for research purposes. The levels are usually pretty open and maneuverable, making it easy to get a hang of the controls. However, there's an invisible height ceiling in place, and there are certain levels which involve narrow sewer pipes. The weapons are pretty varied, with a wide selection available to the player. Of course, there are the standard weapons like the pistol, magnum, shotgun, and machine gun, but there are also weapons like the spreader grenades, the homing Tesla laser, the EMP cannon, the stun gun, the laser buster, the guided rocket launcher, and the homing missile launcher. The effects and graphics, however, consist of low-resolution textures and minimal particle effects. The short render distance also makes it so the environments are shrouded in gray, with a lot of the environment not visible at first glance. The game's soundtrack, for the most part, consists of UK garage music, an electronic music genre that was popular at the time. However, a lot of the tracks repeat themselves, so there aren't very many music tracks to listen to. As far as the story's presentation goes, the mission objectives are shown through text boxes, with what we can only presume is command telling you what you need to do. All of the missions lead up to your encounter with the evil Herd Queen, who you eventually have to fight one-on-one. After fighting her not once, but twice, the Queen is defeated and the Garden is saved. And just like that, evil has been defeated. And the hero is rewarded with... the credits.
Wait, what?
As I said before, the story is very simple. The plot can be summed up with one paragraph and there are really no plot details to speak of. Normally this would be a bit of a detriment. However, much like Mario games, a solid combination of gameplay and presentation can excuse a simple story and turn it into a memorable gameplay experience. Nonetheless, there are still some problems with the story that need addressing. After all, just because a story is simple doesn't mean that it can't be compelling. Usually a story is as compelling as its characters, but this game has no real characters to speak of, not even Buck Bumble himself. The dialogue in between missions only tells you what you need to do, and it doesn't engage the player in the slightest. It's the equivalent of a math professor droning on about what homework you need to do, and then you go do it, and that's it.
Alright class, today we're going to be covering polynomials. Now what you'll want to do is break down the equation as shown here. Isn't that right, Lewis?
It's a lie, I'm not playing Mega Man!
The gameplay isn't any better either, despite how much the game keeps trying to be Star Fox 64. And really, that's one of its major problems. It keeps trying to be Star Fox 64. The game was even advertised in the UK as Lilat Wars, but off the rails, and yet the controls are nowhere near precise enough to be in the same category. Flying and shooting are okay, but aiming while flying is almost an impossibility. To properly aim, the player would have to come to a complete stop, which breaks the flow of the game entirely. It's not like the controls themselves don't work though, you can still press a button and it'll do something. The problem is that the actual functions of the controls are inherently flawed, especially if you try to do too many things at once. Anything outside of simple flying and shooting becomes a struggle, making the game frustrating to play. And to make matters more frustrating, the controls lead to a lot of cheap deaths. If you hit the water, you immediately begin to drown. If you hit the ground, you're relegated to cumbersome tank controls. If you stop in mid-air, you begin to descend. And worst of all, if you slow down or stand still in any way, the game is riddled with cheap deaths all over the place, but none are more frequent than being stun-locked while surrounded by enemies. It brings the game flow to a screeching halt, and makes it hard to get invested in the gameplay if you're dying due to bad game design. To its credit, the music is relatively decent. It's not groundbreaking in any way, but it has a nice mellow beat to it that makes the game feel almost cartoony in a 90s hip-hop sort of way. The graphics, however, are a complete joke. Not only do a lot of the stages offer no variety as far as the environments go, but the colors are completely dull and the low-res textures are pretty bad. The stages are pretty much saturated in green, brown, and gray, and the only thing that sticks out are the yellow bugs. To make the presentation worse, the short render distance takes the already dull colors and shrouds them in a cloud of gray. I mean, the Nintendo 64 may not have been a powerhouse console, but it could definitely handle better textures than this. The more we delve into this game, the more it seems like Argonaut truly was trying to compete with Star Fox 64. Not only does Argonaut's history already explain how this is a very real possibility, but the game itself makes no attempt to hide how much Star Fox influenced it.
Tell me if this sounds familiar. There are critters at war and the bad guys are threatening to take over. The good guys are criminally underpowered, so they hire an ace pilot to take matters into his own hands. The ace pilot can shoot anything out of the sky, and at the beginning of each mission, gets his mission objectives laid out for him. Meanwhile, at the end of the game, you fight the leader of the bad guys who has not one, but two forms, with the second one being his true form. It's not even subtle!
The difference between their stories doesn't lie in the contents of the plot, though. It lies in the presentation of their characters. Like I said before, Buck Bumble has no real characters to speak of, but the tragedy is that it really wouldn't have been that difficult to include some. Something as simple as having Buck comment about command to orders would have gone a long way to establishing a personality for him. Even better, maybe include some more characters to make the plot more compelling. Something as simple as having rival characters instead of the few pathetic boss fights this game has to offer, or even providing an NPC-controlled ally character in some stages, just to mix things up. It's not like they would even need to be different characters, really. They could have just reskinned Buck and given him a different name, and bam, there you go. I mean, it worked for Street Fighter 2, didn't it? Twice. Let's not even talk about Mortal Kombat. The gameplay, though, could have benefited from more effort put into the controls. While it's obvious that the gameplay revolves around the flight and combat, neither one is really all that polished. Turning in mid-air is cumbersome and lacks any sort of precision, and aiming is damn near impossible unless you're completely still. As such, it would have been better to focus completely on flight, and make the controls as tight as possible on that front. Meanwhile, the aiming could have been reduced to a lock-on cursor like the charged laser in Star Fox 64. In this way, aiming could have been made easier without taking out the combat altogether. Not to mention, it would have been a lot more fun to navigate the environment since there would be less stopping in mid-air. But of course, the level design would have to change to compensate for the new controls, so let's tackle that. The way the levels are right now, they're outright boring. They're wide open spaces that only serve to bring attention to the short render distance, and they feel like they were designed this way to avoid tightening the controls. To their credit, it is a lot easier to deal with the controls in wide open spaces. But all the same, it doesn't excuse the fact that the controls just aren't that good.
With the gameplay more focused on navigation rather than combat, the levels would need to be redesigned in such a way that navigation would be challenging and fun. That means narrow corridors to bring attention to the tight controls, and environmental hazards to add a level of challenge to the navigation. We wouldn't even need to get rid of the drowning and the ground controls. We would just have to bring more attention to the fact that they're hazards, like making the water an unappealing color, or adding a grass texture to the ground to make it seem like you can get tangled up, therefore justifying the bad ground controls.
Just for a second, I want to bring attention to one of the later levels in the game. Mission 16, which entails a botched bomb escort that turns into a race to escape the blast radius. The focus in this mission isn't combat, but instead navigating through the sewers as fast as possible. It's a very hectic mission, and even if it's on a timer, it's actually pretty fun compared to everything else. There's still some enemies you have to attack, but for the most part, they line up in front of you and you can blast through them with ease. It's a good example of how a focus on navigation could have made this game more fun, had the controls been tighter and the combat been easier. Changing the level design like this would also have an added benefit. It would get rid of the wide open spaces and bring less attention to the render distance. This way we'd be able to focus on making the textures more vibrant and eye-catching. Or maybe, just maybe, having some more varied levels that aren't just wide open gardens. I mean, I get it, the game takes place in a garden, but this is a video game. If we wanted to, we could change the garden to be purple with a green sky, with blue underground caves with orange crystals. I mean, yeah, it'd be weird and definitely not realistic, but is realism really a concern in a game where a cyborg bee is fighting mutant wasps?
As a game, Bumble is mostly harmless. Given how simple the game is, it's hard to judge it to the same standards as something like Splatterhouse or Project Sylphid. Nonetheless, the game is still deeply flawed. The gameplay is pretty lackluster, and the presentation for the whole game is bare bones at best. Had these flaws been addressed, I feel like the game could have actually turned out to be something memorable. As it is, we got a half-finished game with sloppy design that became just another harmless mascot game that flew under the radar. Really, the only memorable thing about this game is the catchy theme song. That and the multiplayer mode, where you play soccer with two characters and basically shoot the ball into each other's goal. Unfortunately, I didn't record any multiplayer footage, so...
Hey there, thanks for watching. If you liked it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to let me know. If you guys want to watch some more videos, check out the annotations above. And if you want to stay up to date on what I'm doing, don't forget to follow me on social media. Lastly, I want to give a special thanks to my friends Alex and Laura for helping me with this video. If you guys want to check out some of their works, I'll leave links in the description below. Anyways, don't forget to join us next time, where we take a critical look at Shovel Knight. Until then though, I'll see you guys later.
Alright. Aren't you recording now?
Yeah.
So what's that recorded?
No, not that.
Should I hit my nuts again?
No!